Good afternoon and welcome to this RSA webinar. I am Stefania Fiorentino and I currently work at the Bartlett School of Planning at University College London. This webinar is organized by the Regional Studies Association, which is the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development and policy. The RSA supports its members with latest research, funding schemes, networking and publishing opportunities, and spaces to grow research and careers. As a response to the current global crisis, the RSA board put in place initiatives to support its members and the wider community, such as this professional development webinar series, which offers sessions on academic publishing, networking skills, and career development, as well as another webinar series, the Region Cities Industry, that delivers monthly sessions by experts in the fields of regional studies, science, planning, or policy. Today's webinar is the last in the current series, and it has been organized following feedback from the RSA Network for Early and Mid-Career Women in Regional Studies and Regional Science. If you are interested in joining the network, please get in touch with RSA. And following on the great success and continuing popularity, the RSA Professional Development Webinar Series and the Regions Cities Industry Webinar Series will resume in September after a short summer break, well-deserved, I would say, in August. So a list of forthcoming webinars will shortly be published on the RSA website. Now, before we start this webinar, a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is recorded and will then made available by the RSA members on the RSA members lounge. If you have questions, so we run a Q&A section at the end. So if you have questions, you can start typing them down throughout the seminar using the Q&A button. And it is with a great pleasure that I introduce today's speaker, Dr. Lucy Natarajan, which is not only a great colleague of mine, but she's also teaching and researching at the Bartlett School of Planning at University College London. Her research work has always focused on public participation in spatial planning, and she has previously run major academic research projects and policy research programs also for UK government, the UK's Royal Town Planning Institute, and the Commonwealth Association of Planners. She has been running focus groups for decades, and this is her methodological specialty, and that's why we are honored to have her here today. And this session will focus on the nature of the changes introduced for qualitative research during COVID lockdown, and Lucy will share with us her experiences on preparation, running, and data management of virtual focus groups, and discuss the value and challenges of moving qualitative research online. So Lucy, I leave the screen to you, and especially for your preliminary activity.
Thank you very much, Stefania, and thank you to everybody for joining us. I can already see in the chat we have people from very different parts of the world, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to share my experiences, and I'm also keen to understand your experiences as well, so please do let us know about those in the chat and questions. But before I start, it would be really wonderful if you would participate in a very brief 3-question poll, which will give me a sense of your research experience and interests. So Alex, who's supporting us, is putting the first question up now. Thanks very much. So if you are a researcher, what sort of research do you do? That would help me to know if it's mainly quantitative, mainly qualitative, and that obviously includes focus groups, which I will talk about, whether you are a mixed mode researcher or if you're not a researcher as well. And so if you can just choose the category that best suits you on that little poll there, if you can see it. It doesn't matter if you can't, but it's interesting if you can. So shall we see what the results are? So mainly qualitative, but also some quant, and some people who are not researchers and some people who have a mix. Great, thank you very much. So if we can close that first question, please. Thanks, Alex. And our next question, if we could put that up, is so that I have a sense of your experience of focus groups. And here, if you're not a researcher, I'd also like to know if you've been involved at all online, face-to-face, both types, online and face-to-face, or perhaps neither. No focus groups at all. So just give that a second. As I say, it doesn't matter if you can't see it, it's just to give me a sense of things. Shall we see what the results are now? Thanks, Alex. So most people have done face-to-face if they've done it, and some people have not done focus groups at all. That's really helpful. Thanks very much and interesting. So we'll close that. And the final question, very, very short survey. The final question is that obviously I really want this to be useful. So I'm very interested to know if you're considering running an online focus group for the first time. Obviously during the pandemic, except perhaps for lucky places like New Zealand, most of us can't meet face-to-face in groups, not easily. So online focus groups might be something people are considering doing. So I'm curious about that. Shall we see what the answers to that question were, Alex? Yes, a range. So some people are considering it, and some people, maybe they'll have a little think. Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Hopefully after today, more people will consider virtual face-to-face or face-to-face focus group. Let's see. So only 4% so far has been involved with focus groups online. We did a focus group together, Lucy, and that was at the end of May. And it was quite different from the usual focus group, wasn't it? What was your experience with that, and how would you say it was different? So let's start by that.
Yes, thanks, Stefania. So yes, 29th of May 2020, my first ever online focus group. Quite daunting and quite different. I was using Zoom, so the same technology we're using now, obviously, but at that time, it was pretty new to me as a technology. I'd only really used it for calling my family around the world while I was locked down at home in Oxford during the pandemic. So since then, I've had several online focus groups, and I'll talk about all of these different ones, but I'll focus on one in particular, which was the first one. And the key difference, obviously, of doing it online is that focus groups are very social, aren't they? And so normally you do a focus group with a small group of people in a discussion in a small room quite close together. Obviously that's not possible right now for many reasons, but I thought it was really important to carry on with the research I was doing. So yes, it was very new, very different.
Yes, indeed, it is important to carry on, right? And can you explain why you're using focus groups rather than other qualitative methods? Most of the attendees are doing qualitative research, so maybe it's important to understand why focus groups.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the methods we choose depend on the questions that we're asking. And this particular focus group that I did online in May, it was for a study where we were trying to understand places in a deep way, as we're using that term. And we were focusing on the place of County Durham, but we were based in London. And I think it's worth noting that this work followed on from work that we'd been doing with the UK 2070 Commission, which is an inquiry into regional inequalities. And so the questions we were asking were about historical differences in places in the UK, and I've been doing this with Professor John Tominey at the Bartlett, and also a colleague at UCL in the history department, Florence Sutcliffe-Braithwaite. And what we're trying to do is get behind the statistical geography and situate issues of regional inequalities locally and historically. Florence has been conducting very interesting oral history interviews with individual residents. And the focus groups are building on that by hearing about how people explain social facts, as it were. So focus groups help us to hear how people react to each other's explanations, and that helps us understand how understandings of place are constructed, as it were. So really the value of focus groups and the reason for doing it and continuing is that you can have interaction between diverse people, which you can't really get from interviews or surveys in quite the same way.
And that's interesting. And building up on this interaction with people, right? So you mentioned that, of course, there were people in London, in Oxford, or in County Durham. So still in the UK, but different geographies, and potentially there might be other geographies as well. And how did you mobilize participants? How did you make sure that people were participating in that focus groups?
Yes. So, I mean, it's interesting because in one sense, actually, the way that we recruit was actually the same as previously. So normally we recruit people by email invitations and then follow-up phone calls. So that's remote. So in practical terms, it wasn't necessarily more of a challenge, but of course we had local roots, which even helped us further because we're lucky enough to have Professor Tomini on our team, and he is local to County Durham, so he knows the area, and it gives an extra boost in terms of that initial introduction and networking. So we're not parachuting in without a frame of local reference. And calling nearby actually is quite helpful for trust building, which you need for focus groups. And we also were very lucky to have a local partner organisation, which is the Durham Miners Association, and they advised us and were briefing us about the history of the area. So that was really critical for understanding who we might need to speak to for our events. And it's interesting there because actually it's the local knowledge that was so important for sampling, and that is built up slowly over time, and face-to-face, no doubt. So in addition, it's interesting to think that at this time it was quite difficult because of the pandemic, in that at that time in the UK we weren't even at the peak of the first wave of the pandemic and infections. So people were still working out the logistics of lockdown. Guidance on social distancing was just starting to come out in the UK. And so we were in a position where we wanted diverse people in our focus groups, and we needed to hear from people who were supporting the local area. That was what we were interested in, and we wanted to hear from different sectors, but of course we couldn't approach people in the health sector.
Yeah.
Extremely busy and under stress. But what we found was actually people were really still keen to join, and we did get a range of people from policing, education and other sectors. And by the way, we didn't even offer a token of appreciation. So I think it was the topic that must have mobilized people, as you asked. But it's important to recognize we couldn't do all the preparation online, and we had relied on face-to-face from past events.
Yeah, okay. So still there's some preparation which goes beyond, let's say, the virtual world. And going back, let's say, on side of limitation in a way, would you say that this online format introduces different types of sampling bias, or could you expand a little bit on that topic?
Yes, that's a really important question, actually. It's a real concern with the online forum, and it stands to reason that less well-off people perhaps can't join it as easily because of the resources that are required, computer, internet, and also the skills and knowledges that go around with using these technologies. There's also the matter of time. So if you're busy with work, if you're working 2 jobs, you're less likely to join in, although that could be for online and offline as well. So yes, online forum does definitely introduce a bias, and actually the literature reinforces that idea and suggests that you might get more educated people in these sorts of modes.
Okay, so there's in a way an issue with the type of participants you might be able to reach as well in that sense. And on the practical side of running the event instead, what was different from the actual focus group you've run so far?
Well, for a start, they were shorter, and that was a choice. So we ran them for an hour. Normally I'd run them for 2 hours to go into depth. But because we are all spending a lot of time on computers right now, we know it can be quite tiring in that regard. So we had a shorter event. And the events were also smaller in size. And again, that was a choice. So it tended to take a longer time to organize them. And so I was keen to run them within a particular time frame. So I just cut it off when I had enough people, but we could have had more people. We ended up with what you might call mini focus groups. So around 6 people rather than the full blown 12 or 10 people in a focus group. And actually that worked quite nicely. There's also the issue of technology, because you had to do a lot of practice in advance, and that's, you know, one of the really important practical points to remember, because without your help, frankly, Stefania, I wouldn't have been able to do it or had the confidence to run it, this first one in the first instance, to have somebody there to back me up. So practically it worked well, but it did need adaptation and help.
Okay, and what about, so that concerns the practicality of the event, but what about the participants? And do you think their interaction was different in any ways, or and which ways in that case?
Yeah, so very good question. And normally we'd expect people to be interacting and exchanging, and that's the key added value of the focus group, as I said. But I wasn't even sure if we could do that, because particularly people are strangers to each other and they're meeting online for the first time. Actually, interestingly, they did have good interactions. They were asking questions of each other, and they were referencing points that each other made and building on them, sometimes even contradicting them, which is great. We want to hear that sort of information. So I think that was probably due to the topic. They had in common the place that they were living. That's what we were studying. I also think gallery view helped, and I did insist that people, or suggest that people turned on the gallery view in advance and checked that they had done. But that's interesting again, because when you're seeing people in galleries, you're seeing their faces in a different way. And the theory about people's faces being essential to being present with people and communicating with people, it's not really about online mode. And clearly people were face-to-face and seeing each other, but not physically so. So I want to say, actually, was in some ways this was better, because you could see everybody all the time, and people were in some ways equal, and they took up the same amount of space on the screen. You can get focus groups where people dominate with their body in space, so that's interesting, isn't it? But on the other hand, you did have differences in terms of audio and video quality. And actually I had one participant whose video wasn't working, and another whose video was to the side of his face, so he wasn't looking straight into the camera. It's interesting. So the person who wasn't on video was very different to everybody else, and he had to interject. He couldn't sort of indicate to me he wanted to speak, for example. So that wasn't great for the flow of discussions from his respect. There's also the point about background. So we can all see backgrounds and objects when people are on Zoom, and there are lots of different venues. So some people were in offices, some people were in their bedrooms. So it's a very different range of backgrounds. And I guess it could have been problematic. It might have been distracting, but actually in these events it didn't seem to inhibit people's interactions, which is the main thing.
Yeah, so the backgrounds are becoming the new sort of outfits for an online focus group. But it was my impression that for the one that I've participated with you, that all participants were enthusiastic. What was your idea, and what's your intake on this?
Yes, so people were enthusiastic, but my take is that actually they were not as action oriented as previously. So in previous studies, we've had some really serious follow-up after events between people, even starting new activities together afterwards. Of course, this might be because it was in the online mode. So in previous events, people could walk out of the event together, couldn't they, and had the opportunity to have teas and coffees afterwards and create new connections. And it might also have been because of the lockdown that I think it wasn't quite as action oriented. So everyone was very busy and keen to get off the screens after a long day of online meetings. But maybe not, you know, some people might have got in touch afterwards in different ways, you just don't know. So in one event, people did ask if I could organise a second meeting for them. So there was still enthusiasm. But in any case, certainly people enjoyed it. And we even checked their enthusiasm afterwards. We sort of saying, how was it for you? People who stayed on for a little bit afterwards. And they were saying, you know, it did feel very emotional. So there was definitely affect there. It's just maybe not as ready for action at that time.
So it certainly most certainly worked for research. We're less sure whether it worked for actual contacts between the participants and building up on the event. So picking up on that, what about your role as a researcher and moderating the event? Would you say that it was different from the actual focus groups, and if so, how?
Yeah, it's a really key point, because I think a good focus group will have a really permissive environment where people feel free to talk and they feel that they own the conversation. And as a researcher moderating that, you have to encourage it. But I felt I was really having to be very explicit and directive, much more so than normally. So I think particularly at the start of the event, you know, normally people come in, sit down, and I say, could we go around the table? But I'd have to ask everybody, have you got your technology right? now could you introduce yourself? So I was being much more directive. And looking back on the events, I was also much more performative. Obvious postures, large hand gestures, and these sorts of things. So the other thing, I guess, is eye contact. That's really important in building a rapport and encouraging communication. And online, it's not quite the same, is it? And interesting as well to think that I cannot see everything as well on people's faces if I'm trying to read their mood. So the final point is really about being able to see your own face. And that's kind of interesting. It's a little bit problematic in a sense that you glance at yourself. So cognitively, you have an extra layer, as it were. But I think the main point about being a moderator is it's more tiring online.
Yeah, definitely. And seeing your face, I think it's another interesting point. And so picking up on that, were you recording the focus group from Zoom, only audio or audio and video? So how would basically the data collection work in that sense? And how was that different or similar to running an actual focus group?
Yes, so well, actually, we didn't need the video for our data. I could have just used an audio recording with a handheld device, but I did record it. I recorded it within the Zoom, and I recorded it down onto my computer rather than into the cloud. And I found actually the video recording was quite helpful in ways that I hadn't quite anticipated. So when you're transcribing, if you have the video, it's really helpful. You can identify who's speaking much more easily, and you can notice certain things in exchanges that you might not have otherwise done. And by the way, we did offer people the opportunity to test their video with us and to test the setup with us in advance. But interestingly, nobody took us up, even those who'd never used the technology before. And that meant that at the beginning of the events, we had quite a lot of chat around the technology, around the difficulties of technology, people explaining their netiquette, why they weren't looking into the screen and so on. But that was actually really helpful as an icebreaker. So I guess I'd say the video format was not necessarily good as data for the study, but it was certainly great for enabling people to connect.
Yes, definitely. And, you know, I think it's great that there are other things that still needs to be developed. Like you said, you know, we didn't really need the video recording, but in a way that adds another layer of information. So it's great to notice, I think, that it's still a learning curve. It has been a steep learning curve so far, but we are still in the learning curve, and maybe we'll learn even more going forward in the future. And hopefully more people will consider by now running a focus group, who knows? But I think, you know, this has been so far a response to the pandemic, and we hope that we won't have to respond to another pandemic, or that even this pandemic will end pretty quickly. But surely it has opened up the path to new ways of researching and connecting different geographies. Or as this is a sort of the result of the RSA Women Network, maybe supporting people that have childcare responsibilities or any kind of responsibilities for which running an actual face-to-face or focus group or even fieldwork, it's difficult. So there's it's another way of making research more inclusive in a way for the future. So I suggest we now look at the questions from the audience. I see that there are already a number of very interesting questions, a lot of questions, both in the chat and in the Q&A. We have a question in particular from Martin Robertson for you, Lucy. Yes. And it's about the platform used to run focus group. Of course, you said that we've used Zoom, but what happens where your university doesn't pay for a license, and also issues with privacy, and how do you deal with that? Of course, that tends to change from institution to institution, but maybe you can just give a quick answer to that.
Yes, so just briefly, I absolutely appreciate the costs of the full license. if you don't have a full license, you have a 45-minute opportunity on Zoom, but there are absolutely free modes. So there's something called jit.si, jit.si, which is free and not time limited. In terms of the privacy angle, there is an audio option in terms of, rather than wearing a headphone, just allow the voice to come through your computer speaker and use your handheld device rather than putting it into the computer even, let alone the cloud. And I was very it was very important to me not to record straight up into the cloud, because that adds another layer of potential access to the data that I cannot control, as it were, even if all of the privacy.
But in general, I think that, you know, you asked for consent, and all the general ethics and privacy rule applies. And if there's any issue with video recording, you just record the audio. So that's normal sort of issues for qualitative research.
That's
or
right.
It's not very different, isn't it?
No.
Yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, there's a question on instead going back to the sampling bias and the use of technology. Maybe we can reconnect to what is different. And somebody asks whether you have any suggestion on how to get around this issue. Well, it's sort of a tough question in a way, but you know, I don't know. Do you have any suggestion?
Yes, so it is an important question. And in the other project where I've been running focus groups, we noticed that the parts of the area that people were the parts of the area that were represented by participants in the focus group were biased. So we wanted to reach out to those other areas. And again, we had to rely on boots on the ground, offline modes, putting posters up in those areas to encourage people to participate. Putting the current lockdown to one side, you might offer other opportunities. So if your institution had a space where people could come in to access the online facilities, that might be one solution. But most people have phones these days, don't they? So you can use some of these modes on your phone. So that might be just something to highlight to people that doesn't have to be on a computer.
And so there's an interesting question picking up on your point about everyone having phones. And then I have another question on that as well. So maybe I'll start with the one from the audience. Do you foresee any potential for hybrid events? So basically some people being present, some people joining remotely, and whether there would be any value from that?
It's really interesting. My sense is that I would start from the premise of not being hybrid, because in order to facilitate an exchange where everybody feels equally validated within the conversation, you want the opportunities for people to speak to be as even as possible. However, it depends on the nature of what you're asking and the alternatives you have. So if I had, for example, 12 people, but 6 could do it online and 6 could do it face-to-face, I'd rather do 2 mini focus groups. But if it was a really important question with a very specific population, 3 of whom couldn't make it in person, clearly that would be the better option. So it's a kind of cascading logic of decisions.
And I think it's important also what you want to get from the focus group and what you're researching on, probably. And how did you cope with people across different ages and reaching technologies? You already somehow mentioned it, but was that a problem, and how?
So it's interesting because as I mentioned, then you have very different setups, and it was quite clear that people who were less used to being online for social reasons, so generally speaking, the older people, not necessarily old people, but the people who were older in age, were more formal in their interaction and engagement with the technology. They had to spend more time talking about the issues that they'd had. And the fact that for some people, this was actually their first time using Zoom as well, I think that was material to sort of research considerations. Whereas for younger people, they were very relaxed and very open and very used to it.
Okay, and going back to your role as a moderator, which kind of moderation rules for participants were used in the focus groups? That's an actual question from the audience, and I would add whether you needed support in that moderation role and which kind of support.
Yes, so that's really important. So before opening the discussion, there's a sort of ground rules being set, and in relation to the support available, I was worried, it didn't happen, but I was worried that people might have the internet might cut out, or they might have trouble getting online, and that they might need to join later. So if you imagine if you were doing this in a room, if somebody arrives late, you simply signal that they come and join you. But how do you do that? How do you usher someone into a virtual room? And that's where it's essential to have backup, someone who's there, someone who the participants know that they can chat to, because when you're moderating, you're fully focused on the discussions. You have to be. So you can't be dealing with the chat function. So one of the rules of engagement for the events, the way I chose to run them, I'm not saying this is always the right way, but the way I chose to run them was to say to people, I will not use the chat. If you ask me questions on the chat, I won't answer them, or I won't include them. Please speak face to face, because the whole point is to have the exchange between people and as evenly as possible. And the other consideration is that as soon as you break the line of conversation to another sphere, you might have people's attention focusing on that question and lose out the opportunity to hear from everybody on one topic. So, I mean, it is what it says, it's a focus group. The whole group needs to be focused in one place. The other things about moderation is really just to be as permissive as possible, and emphasize to people to speak one at a time, and to let me know if they want to speak by raising their hand or simply saying, can I come in?
And in terms of equality of people and inclusivity, there are a number of different nuanced questions, but I'm conscious of time as well. So I'm going to read one, and maybe you can expand on the topic. So there's one question that says, is an online focus group better than face-to-face in terms of power equation? Are less powerful actors, do less powerful actors feel better in raising their voice or not? So basically, I think it's a question of the usual dynamics of some dominators and how this changes or not. How do you get people to be equal beside the gallery view in that sense?
Yeah, no, that's exactly as you put it, Stefania. There's all these sort of power dynamics, aren't there, in any communicative exchange, and there is no real ideal speech. So the reality is that this is one of the things to be alert to when you're moderating, that there will always be people, you know, without judging, that they are more fluent, they are more confident, perhaps they're used to public speaking, perhaps they're just more passionate, have something to say. Whereas actually in focus groups, one of the key reasons that they were developed was to hear silent voices and tacit knowledge, so things that people know but don't necessarily voice. And focus groups are very powerful for that, but you have to, as exactly this question implies, create the conditions where that can happen. So it's a tricky balance, because you don't want to be directive, you don't want to be telling people, shush, it's not your turn, but you can, with a group, you generally find a balance that might emerge. But if there are people dominating, it's, I would say, so far equally tricky to manage online and face-to-face, but I wouldn't let that put me off doing it. And sometimes you learn something from seeing that power dynamic in play and people's visual responses to it can tell you as much as their actual verbalization.
And probably it's a different way of shining, using one word that was used by the audience. So there are people that have different ways of shining or dominating the conversation when they are in a physical room, and others that deals better with the video. And
yeah, I think that's true. I think, you know, in reality, this is human exchange. People will find ways around it. People who are powerful, who are clever, will always find ways to make their voices heard. But of course, the key thing is that it's absolutely right to allow those voices too. But the point is not to let them squeeze out the other voices, and to make sure that you've given space for those other voices to be heard.
Yeah, there are then more questions on the type of platforms. I think, you know, we've somehow covered that. We've used Zoom, but there are other platforms as well, like Google as well, and that depends really from your institution. Did you use any other tools? And maybe you can give some clues on how you are planning to analyze the data, whether that is somehow different from regular focus group or not.
Yes, so two things there: the analysis and the tools. And I also spot an interesting question about rural settings, and I think that's if I'm reading it right, then you're maybe thinking about the way that there's not maybe broadband in certain areas, and it can obviously be much heavier on the bandwidth. It is harder for people to have a good connection in those areas, and it might just be, and I've not done it myself, but it might just be a case of people turning their videos off in order to allow the conversation to continue. But you might want to have just an initial hello and seeing faces, and then trying to have a conversation without the visual cues, but maybe put moderation rules in play that you will ask people to say, can I speak? And then say, yes, go ahead, so and so, because it's harder to choreograph a discussion when you can't see people's faces. But I don't think it's impossible by any means to do it purely with audio. And in relation to the analysis, the layer of visual data, I dare say, is incredibly interesting, but that will depend on what your what level of questions you're asking, I suppose.
And I think, you know, there's always a limitation. So you mentioned it's more difficult to get people in left behind locations, for example, because they need to have a clear interest in the topic to participate, and that's the same in collaborative planning or research in any sort of field, right? So there's a limitation in that sense, and the same limitation applies in a way to virtual focus group. You might not be able to reach 100% of the people you want to reach. Yes. And but I think I have a question for you, and I'm conscious of time, and maybe this is the last question. Going back on the enhanced possibilities, would you say that video recording adds another layer to discourse analysis, for example? And which kind of added value do you...
Yeah, definitely.
Like, for example, looking at how people look at themselves, which kind of background they've got, and it's in progress. I think it's part of our work as well, but maybe you could elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, that's actually an element I'm really keen to explore more, which is that paralinguistics. So the non-verbal communication that happens, which you can hear in ums and ahs and sighs, which is not words. And you obviously, when you're transcribing, sometimes a transcriber, if you've not instructed them properly, might miss those things out, and they can be really important. So humor and so on can be indicated, or annoyance, and these things, which are part of what you want to understand, perhaps. So I think that sort of linguistics layer could be really, really, really interesting. But I also in relation to you know, whether people respond to their own faces, I think in future I might actually ask people to turn their self view off, if that's the right terminology, but so that they can't see their face, because then it might just change the dynamic slightly, and then we could compare. But that would be a tricky little experiment to run. One final point, if I can, I know time's running out, sorry. The final point I wanted to say was about reach and people who are not able. And I think so far, because I've been really focusing on the focus group method, I perhaps have, I hope, not suggested a kind of, you have to do it by focus group, because it's inevitably the case that you don't reach everybody in any research situation, and that you do have the option of follow-ups with people who you couldn't reach. So for example, there was somebody who couldn't make it to my focus group yesterday, and we're going to have a chat, just the two of us, afterwards, but I will put some of the points that people made during that event to that participant, and then they will tell me what they think as well. So there are creative ways to follow up with people as you think is important.
Yes. Thank you very much, Lucy. And I'm conscious of time. There are many other questions, and they are quite similar to some of the ones we have answered, but a lot of different nuances. But I'm afraid time is running out. So we sort of wrap up. And I'd like to thank you, Lucy, for sharing your experience, for agreeing to have this chat today with me, and for allowing us to learn about virtual focus groups, really. I also want to thank Regional Studies Association, of course, for organizing this event, and the Women Network, which is the very first place where the inspiration for this event came, suggesting Lucy as the best person to run it, really. So as I said at the beginning, we are taking a break in this webinar series for summer, and the webinar series will resume in September. So enjoy the summer. Thank you, Lucy, and goodbye.